The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground as Captain Morrison made his way to Colonel Patterson's office. He had spent a restless night thinking about the Apache woman and the strange circumstances that had brought her to Fort Verde. Something about her continued to puzzle him, and he was eager to learn what Sergeant Rodriguez had discovered during his questioning. As Morrison approached the headquarters building, he could see through the window that Rodriguez was already inside, speaking with the colonel. The Apache woman sat in a chair facing both men, her posture as dignified as it had been the day before. Even in the simple gray dress that had been provided for her by the colonel's wife, she carried herself like royalty. Morrison knocked on the doorframe and was invited in. As he entered, he noticed that the atmosphere in the room was noticeably tense. Colonel Patterson's face wore an expression of barely controlled shock, while Rodriguez looked like a man who had just received devastating news. "Ah, Captain Morrison," the colonel said, his voice carefully controlled. "Please take a seat. Sergeant Rodriguez has been translating our guest's story, and it's rather more significant than we anticipated." Morrison settled into a chair, glancing at the Apache woman. She was watching him with those same intelligent dark eyes. But now there was something else in her expression, a mixture of gratitude and what looked like amusement. "Go ahead, Rodriguez," Colonel Patterson instructed. "Tell the captain what you've learned." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, sir, it turns out our guest here isn't just any Apache woman. She says her name is Ayana, which means eternal blossom in their language. And her father—" Rodriguez paused, swallowing hard. "Her father is Chief Naich of the Chiricahua Apache." Morrison felt his stomach drop. Chief Naich was one of the most powerful and respected Apache leaders in the entire Southwest. He was known to be a skilled warrior and a cunning negotiator, who had managed to keep his people free while many other tribes had been forced onto reservations. He was also known to have a fierce temper when it came to protecting his family. "Sweet Jesus," Morrison breathed. "The chief's daughter." "It gets worse," Rodriguez continued. "She was traveling with a small group of her father's warriors 3 days ago, when they were attacked by those slave traders you arrested. The warriors were killed defending her, and she was taken prisoner. She says her father has been searching for her ever since." Colonel Patterson rubbed his temples, clearly feeling the weight of this new information. "Do we know how many warriors Chief Naich has with him?" "She says at least 50, sir. Maybe more. They've been following the trail of the slave traders, and they're not far behind." Morrison looked at Ayana with new understanding. No wonder she had seemed so composed during her ordeal. She was the daughter of one of the most powerful men in Apache society, raised from birth to handle pressure and danger. She had probably never doubted that her father would come for her. "Has she told her father that she's here?" Morrison asked. Rodriguez translated the question. Ayana spoke for several moments, gesturing occasionally toward the window that faced north. "She says no, sir. She wanted to see what kind of men we were first. She says her father taught her to gather information before making decisions. But she also says that Chief Naich will arrive here today, probably before noon. He's been tracking the slave traders' horses, and the trail leads right to our front gate." The implications of this hit all 3 men at the same time. Chief Naich would arrive at Fort Verde expecting to find his daughter's captors, only to discover that she was being held by the U.S. cavalry, even though Morrison had rescued her. The situation could easily be misinterpreted as an act of war. "Colonel," Morrison said urgently, "we need to get those 3 prisoners ready to hand over immediately. And we need to make it very clear that we rescued Ayana, not captured her." "Agreed," Patterson replied, already moving toward his desk to draft orders. "Rodriguez, explain to Miss Ayana that we're going to return her to her father safely, along with the men who kidnapped her. Make sure she understands that we want no conflict with her people." Rodriguez began translating, but Ayana held up her hand to stop him. She spoke directly to Morrison in halting but clear English. "I understand your words," she said, surprising all 3 men. "I speak small English. Learned from missionary at San Carlos. I tell father. You save Ayana? You good man?" Morrison stared at her in amazement. She had understood everything they had said, possibly since the moment he had first found her with the slave traders. She had been gathering information all along, just as her father had taught her. "You've understood us this whole time?" Morrison asked. Ayanna smiled for the first time since her arrival. "Some words. Not all. But yes, I listen. I watch." "Is Apache way?" Colonel Patterson leaned back in his chair, shaking his head in admiration. "Young lady, you are clearly your father's daughter. Sergeant Rodriguez, have the prisoners brought to the parade ground immediately, and send word to all company commanders. I want every man in dress uniform and ready for inspection within the hour." As Rodriguez hurried out to carry out these orders, Patterson turned to Morrison. "Captain, I want you to personally escort Miss Ayanna to meet her father. You rescued her, so it's fitting that you should return her to Chief Nate yourself." Morrison nodded, though he felt a knot of nervousness in his stomach. Meeting Chief Nate under these circumstances would be unlike any military encounter he had experienced. This wasn't about strategy or tactics, it was about honor, family, and the delicate balance between two cultures that had been at odds for decades. "Ayanna," Morrison said, standing and offering her a respectful bow, "it will be my honor to escort you to your father." She rose gracefully and returned the bow. "You save Ayanna life. Now I save yours. When father come, he be very angry, but I tell him truth about Captain Morrison. You be safe." An hour later, the lookouts in the fort's watchtowers began calling out reports of riders approaching from the north. Morrison stood on the parade ground next to Ayanna, both of them watching the horizon intently. Colonel Patterson was nearby with his staff officers. While the entire garrison stood at attention in their dress uniforms, the first Apache riders appeared as dots on the desert landscape, but they grew larger quickly. Morrison could soon make out individual warriors, and his experienced eye noted their excellent horsemanship and the way they moved in perfect formation despite the rough terrain. "There," Ayanna said quietly, pointing to a rider in the center of the group. "My father." Even at a distance, Chief Nate cut an impressive figure. He sat his horse with natural authority, and Morrison could see that the other warriors positioned themselves in relation to their leader with obvious respect. As the group drew closer, Morrison could make out more details, war paint on some faces, traditional weapons alongside captured rifles, and the kind of alert readiness that marked veteran fighters. The Apache war party stopped about 200 yards from the fort's main gate. Chief Nate rode forward alone, stopping just outside rifle range. Morrison could see him studying the fort's defenses and the soldiers arranged on the parade ground. His gaze lingered on the 3 bound prisoners who had been placed prominently in view, and then moved to where his daughter stood beside Morrison. "He waits," Ayanna explained. "Apache custom. Show respect but also show strength. He want you to come to him." Colonel Patterson nodded to Morrison. "Captain, you and Miss Ayanna may proceed. We'll keep the prisoners here where Chief Nate can see them." Morrison and Ayanna walked slowly across the open ground between the fort and where Chief Nate waited. Morrison kept his hands visible and his movements deliberate, showing that he carried no weapons in his hands. As they approached, he got his first clear look at the legendary Apache leader. Chief Nate was a man in his 40s, with intelligent eyes and strong features marked by years of desert sun and wind. He wore traditional Apache clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, and eagle feathers adorned his long black hair. His horse was a magnificent pinto stallion that stood perfectly still. Despite the tension in the air, when they were about 20 feet away, Ayanna called out to her father in Apache. The relief and joy in her voice were unmistakable, though she maintained the composure expected of a chief's daughter. Chief Nate's stern expression softened for just a moment as he heard his daughter's voice, but his eyes remained fixed on Morrison. Ayanna spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward Morrison and then back toward the fort. Morrison caught his own name several times, and he hoped she was explaining how he had rescued her from the slave traders. Chief Nate listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Ayanna finished speaking, Chief Nate studied Morrison for a long moment. Then, to Morrison's surprise, the Apache leader dismounted and walked toward them. Morrison remained still, letting the chief approach at his own pace. Chief Nate stopped directly in front of Morrison and spoke in English. That was heavily accented but perfectly clear. "You are Captain Morrison. You saved my daughter?" "Yes, sir," Morrison replied formally. "I was honored to help her." "The men who take her? They are your prisoners now?" "Yes, sir. They're slave traders, and they were breaking U.S. law when they captured your—" The dust kicked up from Captain James Morrison's horse as he rode hard across the Arizona desert in 1882. His blue cavalry uniform was stained with sweat and dirt from 3 days of tracking Apache raiders who had attacked a supply wagon heading to Fort Verde. The sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky terrain, and Morrison squinted against the glare as he scanned the horizon for any sign of movement. Morrison had been stationed at Fort Verde for 2 years now, and he understood the Apache better than most soldiers. Unlike many of his fellow officers who saw them only as savages to be eliminated, Morrison recognized their intelligence, their deep knowledge of the land, and their fierce determination to protect their way of life. This understanding had kept him alive through several encounters, but it also made his job more complicated. The trail had grown cold near a cluster of red sandstone formations when Morrison heard the sound of struggling voices echoing off the rocks. He dismounted quickly, drew his revolver, and crept toward the noise. Peering around a boulder, he saw 3 white men in rough frontier clothing surrounding a young Apache woman. She was bound with rope, but her dark eyes blazed with defiance as she glared at her captors. "Stop fighting, you little wildcat," growled the largest of the men, a bearded outlaw named Pete Hawkins. "You're worth good money to the right buyer, so quit making this harder than it needs to be." Morrison's jaw tightened. He had heard rumors of men who captured Apache women and children to sell as slaves or servants to wealthy families in Mexico or California. The practice disgusted him, even though relations between his people and the Apache were often hostile. The young woman couldn't have been more than 18 years old. Her long black hair was braided with small turquoise beads, and she wore a traditional Apache dress made of soft deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork. Despite being outnumbered and bound, she held herself with a dignity that impressed Morrison. When one of the men reached out to grab her arm, she twisted away and spat words in Apache that clearly weren't compliments. Morrison counted the odds. 3 armed men against 1 cavalry officer wasn't ideal, but he had the advantage of surprise. More importantly, he couldn't stand by and watch this happen. He had taken an oath to protect civilians, and in his mind, that included Apache women who were being illegally captured. "That's far enough," Morrison called out, stepping into view with his revolver trained on the men. "Release the woman and ride out, and nobody has to get hurt." Pete Hawkins spun around, his hand moving toward the gun on his hip. Well, looks like we got ourselves a hero. You best mind your own business, soldier boy. This here's between us and our property." "She's not property," Morrison said firmly, keeping his weapon steady. "She's a human being, and what you're doing is against federal law. Now let her go." The second man, thin and nervous with shifty eyes, licked his lips anxiously. "Pete, maybe we should listen to him. He's cavalry, and if word gets back to the fort—" "Shut up, Tommy," Hawkins snapped. "1 soldier against 3 of us? I like those odds." He drew his pistol with surprising speed, but Morrison was ready for it. The gunfight erupted quickly in the confined space between the rocks. Morrison dove behind a boulder as bullets ricocheted off the stone around him. He could hear the Apache woman shouting something, but he couldn't understand her words over the gunfire. He waited for a pause in the shooting, then sprang up and put a bullet through Pete Hawkins' shoulder, spinning the big man around. The thin man named Tommy threw down his weapon immediately and raised his hands. "Don't shoot." "I'm done." The third man, however, was trying to circle around to get a better angle on Morrison. The captain spotted the movement and fired again, this time hitting the man in the leg. He went down cursing and clutching his wound. "Anybody else want to try their luck?" Morrison called out, reloading his revolver quickly. When no one answered, he stepped out from behind his cover. Keeping his gun ready, Pete Hawkins was sitting on the ground, holding his wounded shoulder and glaring at Morrison with pure hatred. "You're making a big mistake, soldier. That Savage's people have been raiding settlements all summer. She's probably got American blood on her hands." "Maybe so," Morrison replied, moving toward the Apache woman. "But that doesn't give you the right to kidnap and sell her." He kept his weapon trained on the three men while he approached the young woman cautiously. She watched him with suspicious dark eyes, clearly uncertain whether this new development was good or bad for her. Morrison holstered his pistol and raised his hands to show he meant no harm, then slowly reached for the knife on his belt to cut her bonds. "Easy," he said quietly, though he doubted she understood English. "I'm going to cut you loose." As the ropes fell away from her wrists, the young woman rubbed the raw marks where they had bitten into her skin. She looked at Morrison for a long moment, then spoke a few words in Apache while pointing at the three outlaws. Morrison didn't understand her language, but her meaning seemed clear enough. She was asking what would happen to the men who had captured her. "I'm taking them back to face justice," Morrison told her, knowing she probably couldn't understand but hoping his tone would convey his meaning. "You're free to go?" But the young woman didn't move to leave. Instead, she studied Morrison with intelligent eyes, as if trying to decide something important. She spoke again, this time pointing at herself and then at Morrison. Pete Hawkins laughed bitterly from where he sat bleeding. "Looks like your new friend wants to stick around, Captain. Course, she might just be planning to slit your throat when you ain't looking." Morrison ignored the outlaw and focused on the Apache woman. There was something in her manner that suggested she was trying to communicate something specific. She repeated her gesture, pointing at herself and then at Morrison, and added what sounded like a question. Suddenly it occurred to Morrison that she might be asking to come with him. The thought surprised him. Relations between the cavalry and the Apache had been tense all summer, with raids and counter-raids becoming increasingly common. For an Apache woman to voluntarily accompany a cavalry officer was almost unheard of, but as Morrison looked into her eyes, he saw something that convinced him she was serious about her request. Perhaps she had nowhere safe to go. Perhaps she feared other outlaws in the area. Or perhaps she had reasons of her own that he couldn't guess at. "Tommy," Morrison called to the nervous outlaw, "help your friends get mounted. We're heading back to Fort Verde." As the three wounded and demoralized men struggled to their feet, Morrison turned back to the Apache woman. She was watching the proceedings with keen interest, and when she caught his eye, she nodded once as if confirming a decision. The ride back to Fort Verde took most of the day. Morrison had tied the three outlaws' hands and put them on their horses, while the Apache woman rode beside him on Pete Hawkins' spare mount. She seemed comfortable on horseback, moving with the easy grace of someone who had been riding since childhood during the long journey across the desert. Morrison found himself stealing glances at his unexpected companion. She rode in silence for the most part, but her eyes were constantly moving, taking in every detail of their surroundings. It was clear that she missed nothing, and Morrison suspected she could find her way back to this spot blindfolded, if necessary. As they approached the fort in the late afternoon, Morrison began to wonder what kind of reception awaited them. Fort Verde had seen its share of Apache prisoners over the years, but they were usually warriors captured in battle, not young women rescued from slave traders. He wasn't sure how Colonel Patterson would react to the situation. The sentries at the gate called out challenges as the small party approached. Morrison identified himself and requested permission to enter with his prisoners. As they rode through the wooden gates into the dusty compound, soldiers and civilians stopped what they were doing to stare at the unusual group. Morrison could hear whispered conversations starting up behind them as they made their way to the headquarters building. The Apache woman seemed unaffected by the attention, sitting straight in her saddle and looking around the fort with the same careful observation she had shown during their ride. Colonel Patterson emerged from his office as Morrison dismounted. The colonel was a career soldier with gray hair and sharp blue eyes that missed very little. He looked at the three bound outlaws, then at the Apache woman, and finally at Morrison himself. "Captain Morrison," the colonel said formally, "I trust you can explain this unusual situation." Yes, sir, Morrison replied, standing at attention. These three men were in the process of kidnapping this Apache woman, apparently with the intention of selling her into slavery. I intervened and placed them under arrest. Colonel Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly. And the woman? She requested to accompany us back to the fort, sir. I believed it was safer to bring her here than to leave her alone in the desert. The colonel studied the Apache woman, who met his gaze steadily without flinching. There was something in her bearing that impressed him, just as it had impressed Morrison. Very well, Patterson said finally. Get the prisoners secured in the stockade and have the surgeon look at their wounds. As for our unexpected guest? He paused, clearly uncertain about proper protocol for this situation. The Apache woman chose that moment to speak. She said something. 6 months after his encounter with Chief Nate and Ayanna, Captain Morrison found himself facing the most challenging assignment of his military career. Tensions between various Apache groups and white settlers had reached a breaking point, with raids and counter-raids becoming increasingly violent across the Arizona Territory. The War Department in Washington was demanding decisive action, while local commanders struggled to distinguish between hostile Apache bands and those seeking peaceful coexistence. Morrison rode Yahtzee, the Baymare given to him by Chief Nate, along a ridge overlooking the Gila River. The horse had proven to be everything the Apache chief had promised. Intelligent, sure-footed, and tireless even in the harsh desert conditions. More importantly, Morrison had discovered that riding an Apache-trained horse opened doors that would otherwise remain closed. Other Apache groups recognized the animal's origins and understood its significance, the mission that brought Morrison to this remote area was both delicate and dangerous. A group of Chiricahua Apache under Chief Ja had been accused of raiding settlements near Tucson, killing several civilians and driving off livestock. The territorial governor was demanding immediate military action, but Morrison had been sent to investigate the accusations before any retaliation was authorized. What made the situation particularly sensitive was that Chief Ja was closely related to Chief Nate. Any military action against Ja's band could easily destroy the fragile peace that Morrison had helped establish with Nate's people. Colonel Patterson had specifically chosen Morrison for this mission because of his unique relationship with the Apache leadership. As Morrison studied the valley below through his field glasses, he spotted smoke rising from what appeared to be a hidden camp deep in the canyon. He knew that approaching an Apache camp uninvited was extremely dangerous, but he also knew that the alternative, a large-scale military sweep through the area, would likely result in far more bloodshed. He dismounted and checked his weapons, then began the careful descent into the canyon. Yahtzee followed him with the confident steps of a horse familiar with rocky terrain. Morrison had no doubt that Apache sentries had already spotted him, and his life now depended on whether they recognized him as the man who had saved Chief Nate's daughter. About halfway down the canyon wall, Morrison heard a voice call out in Apache. He stopped immediately, raising his hands to show he carried no weapons, and called back in the few Apache words he had learned over the past months. I am Captain Morrison, friend of Chief Nate. I come to speak with Chief Ja. There was a long pause, followed by the sound of voices conferring in the distance. Morrison remained perfectly still, knowing that Apache warriors were probably studying him through rifle sights at that very moment. Finally, a figure emerged from behind a cluster of boulders, a young Apache warrior who approached cautiously. The warrior spoke rapid Apache, too fast for Morrison to follow. But then he gestured toward Yahtzee and spoke a single word that Morrison recognized. Nate. Morrison nodded. Yes, gift from Chief Nate. I saved his daughter Ayanna. Understanding dawned in the young warrior's eyes. He had obviously heard the story of the cavalry officer who had rescued the chief's daughter from slave traders. The warrior made a gesture for Morrison to follow and began leading him deeper into the canyon. The Apache camp was hidden in a natural amphitheater surrounded by high canyon walls. Morrison counted about 30 warriors and twice that many women and children. The camp showed all the signs of a people under pressure, sentries posted at every approach, horses kept saddled and ready, and weapons within easy reach of every adult male. Chief Joe emerged from a large wickiup as Morrison entered the camp. He was an older man than Nate, with gray streaking his long hair and deep lines etched by years of sun and worry. His eyes were intelligent but wary as he studied the cavalry officer. Morrison dismounted and approached slowly, keeping his hands visible. He had learned enough Apache protocol to know the importance of showing proper respect to a chief, even under these circumstances. "Chief Joe," Morrison said formally, "I come with words from Colonel Patterson at Fort Verde. May I speak?" Chief Joe studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward a circle of stones where several of his senior warriors were seated. Morrison joined the circle, sitting cross-legged as he had seen Apache men do during councils, for the next hour. Morrison listened as Chief Joe told his side of the story that had brought military attention to his band. The chief spoke in a mixture of Apache and broken English, with occasional translation help from warriors who had learned some English during previous interactions with soldiers or traders. According to Joe, his people had not raided any settlements near Tucson. They had been hunting in the mountains west of the river when they discovered the bodies of several Apache women and children who had been killed by white men. The dead included Joe's own niece, a girl no more than 12 years old. Joe's warriors had tracked the killers to an isolated ranch where they found evidence of the murders, bloody clothing that belonged to the Apache victims. In their anger and grief, the warriors had attacked the ranch, killing the men responsible and taking the horses as compensation for their losses. "We did not raid innocent people," Chief Joe concluded, his voice heavy with emotion. "We punished murderers. Is this wrong in white man's law?" Morrison felt his stomach tighten as he began to understand the real situation. The men killed at the ranch had probably been the actual raiders, preying on both Apache families and white settlers alike. Joe's warriors had essentially done the job that the cavalry should have done. They had tracked down and eliminated criminals, but Morrison also knew how the incident would be reported in the territorial newspapers. The deaths of the Apache victims would be ignored or dismissed, while the attack on the ranch would be portrayed as another example of Apache savagery requiring immediate military response. "Chief Joe," Morrison said carefully, "can you show me where you found the bodies of your people?" The chief nodded grimly and called for horses to be prepared. Within minutes, Morrison found himself riding with a dozen Apache warriors toward the mountains where the killings had taken place. He was acutely aware that he was probably the first U.S. cavalry officer to ride voluntarily with an Apache war party. But the unusual circumstances seemed to call for unusual measures. The ride took most of the afternoon, winding through terrain that would have been impossible to navigate without Apache guides. Morrison was impressed once again by the warriors' knowledge of their homeland. They seemed to know every canyon, every water source, every game trail across hundreds of square miles. The site where the Apache victims had been found was a small clearing beside a seasonal stream. Chief Joe's warriors had buried their dead according to Apache custom, but the evidence of the killings was still clearly visible. Morrison dismounted and examined the area carefully, using his experience as a cavalry officer to read the signs. What he found confirmed Chief Joe's account. The tracks and other evidence indicated that a group of at least 6 well-armed men had ambushed the Apache family as they camped by the stream. The attack had been sudden and brutal, giving the victims no chance to defend themselves. Morrison also found something that made his blood run cold, a cavalry button from a U.S. Army uniform, apparently lost during the attack. The implications were staggering. Either deserters from the Army were involved in the killings, or worse, active duty soldiers had murdered innocent Apache civilians. "Chief Joe," Morrison said, holding up the button, "I need to investigate this further. Will you give me time to find out who really killed your people?" The Apache chief stared at the military button for a long moment, his face growing darker. "Your soldiers kill Apache women and children?" Morrison felt the weight of the moment. How he answered this question could determine whether the fragile peace with the Apache would survive or explode into all-out war. "I don't know," Morrison answered honestly, "but I promise you I will find out. And if U.S. soldiers were involved, they will face justice under military law." Chief Juh considered this for several minutes, conferring quietly with his warriors. Finally, he turned back to Morrison. You saved daughter of my brother Nate. You speak truth. I give you 10 days to find answers. After that, if there is no justice, we make our own justice. Morrison nodded, understanding the ultimatum. He had 10 days to identify the real killers and bring them to trial, or Chief Juh would launch a war that could spread across the entire territory. The ride back to Fort Verde took Morrison most of the night. He pushed Yahtzee hard, knowing that every hour was precious. As soon as he arrived at the fort, he went directly to Colonel Patterson's quarters. Despite the early morning hour, Patterson listened grimly to Morrison's report, examining the cavalry button under the light of his desk lamp. Jesus Christ, the colonel muttered. If this is what I think it is... Sir, I need permission to investigate the personnel records for the past month. Anyone who's been absent without leave, anyone who's had disciplinary problems, anyone who might have reason to be in that area. Patterson nodded immediately. You have it. Take Sergeant Rodriguez with you. He knows the